Hi, everyone. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming along today, or I guess you could be staying at home and watching this. I'm Andrew Steele, and I'm going to be talking to you for the next sort of 40 or 50 minutes or so about my book, Ageless, The New Science of Getting Older Without Getting Old. I want to try and give you a bit of an insight into how the aging process works and what it is that we can do about it. And before we start, I just thought I'd give you a little bit of background about myself, because actually I started out not as a biologist, but as a physicist. And it was as I was coming toward the end of my physics PhD that I first started reading about aging biology and about how fascinating and important this science is, and decided to change career. And actually, the reason I decided to change career was rather unusual. It's because of a graph. So what I want to do is show you that graph. It's actually going to be quite a key feature of this talk, and sort of show you why I think aging is such an important thing, and why I think really this is the greatest sort of scientific humanitarian challenge and opportunity of our time. So let's bring in some slides here. So what I'd like to do during this talk is sort of allow everyone to reimagine what they think about aging. So I think when a lot of people think of aging, we just think of it as a natural process. It's sort of the natural byproduct of being alive, getting wrinkly, getting grey, getting wise, getting older. All of these things are just part of being human. But what I want to do is reimagine it as not just this natural process, but the world's biggest humanitarian challenge. And I already mentioned that. It might sound a bit strange, a bit counterintuitive. I'd like to dig into a bit about why it is that I think that, and what we can do about it. Because the other thing that I think a lot of people think about the aging process is it's inevitable. It's something that happens to us. It happens to our pets at a rather more rapid rate than it happens to us. All our friends, everyone throughout human history has aged. They've deteriorated as they've got older. So therefore, it can seem like it's this inevitable process. But actually, brand new biology is really showing us this isn't the case at all. There are literally dozens of ways we have in the lab now to slow down or even reverse the aging process. And what that means is, well, it's very exciting, because it means on the one hand, we've got the world's biggest humanitarian challenge, and on the other, we've got the science that's going to allow us to rise to that challenge. So this isn't just some sort of hopeless, admitting of the terrible toll of aging. There's actually something we can do about it. And I think this combination means that we could be in for the greatest revolution in medicine since the discovery of antibiotics. We're going to come up with drugs that can treat the aging process, and I'll explain a bit more about what they might look like and why it is such an enormous revolution as we go through the talk. But I already mentioned that I was going to start by showing you the graph that changed my career. So let's, without further ado, have a little look at this thing. It's quite a simple graph. Along the bottom here, you've got how old you are, and then up the side, you've got how your percentage chance of dying in that particular year. And I think the easiest way to look at this is just obviously to put the line on the graph. And I think all of us know that old people are more likely to die, but just how much really shocks me. So this is what the graph looks like. You can see, the easiest way to sort of make sense of this is to go through and put some numbers on it. So let's do that and try and understand what this means. So the first thing is that when you're born in your sort of 0th year of life, your first year of life, as it were, you've actually got about a 0.5% chance of dying. That's your riskiest year for a while. And that's because you can be born with, you could be born with a genetic problem, or you could be born with there were just basically all kinds of infectious diseases and things that can strike you down in your first year of life. But if you're fortunate enough, and obviously most babies are fortunate enough now in the rich world to make it through that first year, your odds of death carry on decreasing and decreasing throughout childhood until you get to the age of 10. And current 10-year-olds have an incredible title. They are the safest humans in the history of our species. They've got a less than 1 in 10,000 chance of not making their 11th birthday. But unfortunately for all of us, it's basically downhill, or rather on this graph, uphill from there. So by the time you're 18, your risk of not making your 19th birthday is about 1 in 3,000. I'm in my 30s. That means my risk of death is somewhere around 1 in 1,000 a year. And it's worth just sort of thinking about what that actually means for a moment, because, actually I quite like those odds. Because what that would suggest is that if I were able to continue with those same odds throughout my life, I'd live into my 1,030s on average. But obviously, of course, this isn't what happens. If you're a human being, your risk of death, and I guess everyone who's watching this probably is, your risk of death will increase by a factor of about 2 every 8 years or so. And what that means is, it starts out quite low when you're young, but if you carry on doubling and doubling and doubling something, it can go from quite small to very big very quickly. So let's fast forward. If I make it to the age of 65 and nothing happens to medicine in the intervening time, my risk of death that year will be somewhere in the region of 1 in 100, 1%. And that's still not too bad, because if that were to continue, then, you'd live to 165 on average. You can already see the horizons getting a bit shorter. But obviously, by the time you've got 1%, that's the sort of number that when you start doubling it every 8 years, it can start to actually get quite big. So once you make it to 80, your odds of not making your 81st birthday around 5%, so 1 in 20. And if you make it to way off the top of this graph up here into your 90s, it's literally life and death at the roll of a dice. You've got a 1 in 6 chance of not making your next birthday. So what does this graph mean? Well, as a human, you can look at this thing and just think, wow, that's terrifying. I've got this exponential wall of mortality coming at me. But as a scientist, you can look at this and you can think, well, actually, there's something really fascinating going on here. There's this incredibly universal process that means all human beings have this remarkably constant 8-year, what's called a mortality rate doubling time, the length of time it takes for our risk of death to double. So what is it? What process underlies this? What collection of biological changes is it that makes us more likely to die in this incredibly synchronized way? And this 8-year doubling time, by the way, it's universal almost across cultures, across time. It doesn't matter any human beings you choose to look at. Some have higher and lower risks of death at particular times, sure. But that 8-year doubling time seems to be a feature of, the species Homo sapiens. So what is it about that? And if we could come up with medicines that could intervene in that aging process, could we do something about it? Could we do something about all the terrible causes of death that underlie this? So what's going on? What we're going to have to do is ask the question, what is aging? And I think when most of us think of aging, we think of a variety of different things. And I've already alluded to one of them at the beginning of the talk, which is that a lot of us think of the obvious sort of cosmetic external signs, things like wrinkles and grey hair. And those are, obviously they're very easy to see. You can, tell how old somebody is often by looking at them. But what they're really indicative of is a variety of biological changes. They're caused by the same biological changes that are going on inside our bodies. So these external signs reflect sort of effectively the wrinkles and grey hair that are inside our bodies that cause all kinds of different changes. And one of those different changes is that we're at a vastly increased risk of disease. So diseases like cancer, heart disease, stroke, dementia, all of these things, they're radically increased in probability just by getting older. So what that means is, obviously this is one of the reasons that we saw that slide for the risks of death, the graph for the risks of death is caused by these various diseases. It's not just about wrinkles and it's not just about diseases. There are also various kinds of what I've classed here basically as different kinds of loss. So this is things like vision loss, muscle loss, hearing loss and memory loss. And really what all of these different things mean is a loss of independence. It means a loss of the ability to, get around the house, a loss of the ability to play with your grandkids, engage in your hobbies, whatever it is you want to do. And there are a whole variety of different ways these things can happen. And finally, there are the changes that aren't directly related to aging, things like infectious diseases and injuries. These are things that can happen to young people, but are much more severe when they happen if you're older. So, for example, if you're a young person and you break a bone, it might mean a few weeks in a plaster cast, but, your bone pretty much gets better. But if you're an older person and you break your hip, for example, you can end up having to go into hospital. You might spend weeks and weeks in a hospital bed. You lose a load of muscle mass because you've been lying still for all that time. You might contract a hospital-acquired infection. In fact, people can effectively die of the consequences of a broken hip, or at the very least, it can radically change the future course of your life. Something that as a young person is very unlikely to either happen in the first place. And even if you do break a bone, the consequences are much less severe. So this whole constellation of things are some of the changes that result from the aging process. And so, what does that mean? We're going to have to go back to this graph. As I suggested, a lot of these deaths are caused by diseases. So if we were to draw a graph of those 4 diseases that I mentioned, you can see that rather than your chance of death here, we've got your chance of illness per year on the vertical axis now, based upon how old you are. Then cancer looks something like this, heart disease, stroke, and dementia is something that's almost unheard of in young people. But by the time you get up to the sort of older ages of the graph, it actually increases in probability even faster than the risk of death itself. But basically, regardless of exactly the shape of these curves, you can see they're all very, very similar to that increase in risk of death. That's something that's very, very rare in young people. And as you get over to this side of the graph, they radically increase in probability. So what that means is you've got this exponentially increasing chance of disease. There are also other things that we can look at, not just these diseases that our body effectively does to itself, sort of the diseases of aging. I mentioned infectious disease. This is the probability of getting a chest infection at any point in your life. And you can see that, chest infections, they're relatively likely, however old you are. You've still got a 1 or 2% chance of getting one, even if you're a young adult in your sort of healthiest prime. But if you're at the sort of young end of the spectrum, that means your immune system is not fully developed. Or if you're toward the older end of the spectrum, when your immune system is starting to weaken with old age, you're much more likely to get one of these things. And you're also, of course, much likely to have severe consequences and die from it. And that's, of course, why the flu jab is so very, very important. And not just flu, but the one that we've all been thinking about an awful lot recently. You can have a look here. This is your age in years against your chance of death per year from one specific cause, coronavirus. Again, you can see it's another one of these terrifying exponential curves. And what's really great news is that obviously this curve has been massively flattened out now by the introduction of the vaccinations that most of us have been fortunate enough to have. But nonetheless, you can see that this is very much a disease, not just an infectious disease, but it's a disease of aging. A lot of the severe consequences, the risk of death, come basically because your body, your immune system, all these different parts of you are aging and making you less able, less resilient to these various different things, whether it be an infectious disease, whether it be an injury or whatever. And I think what this graph really shows us is it sort of explodes a myth. I think a lot of people think that you can die of old age, and the sort of way that you might visualize that is just that, you go to bed one night and you just don't wake up the next morning and it's largely painless. But actually, you can't die without being ill. You tend to die of something. And what happens is that one of these diseases eventually becomes severe enough to take your life, be it cancer, be it heart disease or whatever. And so that means that these things aren't just killing us, they're causing this huge sort of these decades of decrepitude, of slow decline. Something like cancer, it doesn't just kill you. It slowly builds up, it causes increasing symptoms. The treatment can be quite grueling as well. So these things are just an enormous, enormous cost on our quality of life as well as the length of our lives. So that's sort of the depressing side of aging, but maybe there is a note of optimism here. Perhaps it's the case that this is something that we in the rich world are lucky enough to suffer from, lucky sort of in air quotes there, but because, we live long enough for these things to be a problem. So let's have a little think about that idea. Now, what I'd normally do, this is, as I say, back to my favourite graph. This, as I say, is what caused me to change career. So this is something that's constantly on my mind. And what I'd normally do back in the days before, streaming these things online is have a quiz. So what I'd like you to do is think about the answer to this question yourself at home. What do you think the global life expectancy is? The life expectancy of everyone, every country all around the world averaged. So to give you a clue, it's a bit above 80 here in the UK. But what I want you to do is think about, not just the rich developed countries like the UK, think about, poorer countries, places like India or China, sort of the middle income countries, or places like Nigeria, the really low income countries. If you average all of those together, what's the global life expectancy? And the reason I ask this is that a lot of people dramatically underestimate the answer. So I'm not going to keep you hanging on any longer. Global life expectancy in the most recent year we've got good data for, back in 2019, was 72.6 years. I think that's a lot longer than most people guess. Actually, if you look at surveys of these things, people frequently guess 10 or even 20 years below what is actually the case. And that's because we imagine there's this big sort of extremely poor developing world where, life expectancy is much, much lower because there's less healthcare, there's less, basically all of their lifestyle is worse. But actually, there's been a fantastic story of progress, particularly over the last 50 years or so. A lot of developing countries are now snapping at the heels of those of us in the rich countries, at least in life expectancy terms. And what that means on this graph is that most people in most countries are living long enough to get a fair way up this curve and experience these negative consequences of aging, all these different diseases, all those different kinds of suffering. So statistically, what this means around the world is that if you look at all the deaths that occur around the world every single day, every one of these little people represents 1,000 deaths. And that means of the 150,000 people who die every single day of all causes on planet Earth, more than 100,000 of them, so more than 2/3, are deaths due to aging. And that's because they're deaths due to diseases like cancer and heart disease and stroke and dementia, all of these things that are made that much more likely by getting older. And so what that means, this essentially is why I'm so worried about aging. It's the single largest cause of death in the world. It's, I'd argue, the greatest cause of human suffering as well, because of all those years that you suffer beforehand with the frailty, the side effects of these diseases and so on. So, this could be quite a depressing talk. It could be quite a depressing book if all I was going to show you is that this is, we've got this huge, huge cause of death. This, one individual thing, aging, is behind all of these things. What can we do about it? Well, I'm going to go back to this graph, and it's the last time, I promise. I did tell you it's a very important graph. This is humans' risk of death. And as I've already mentioned a couple of times, our risk of death doubles every 8 years or so. And so that is effectively the human rate of aging. It's how fast our species can be said to age. But not all animals share this property. And one that we might think about is this little thing here. This is actually quite a small creature. It's a creature called a hydra. It's about 1 centimetre long. They're a freshwater creature that lives by sort of firing out poisonous darts and eating anything it can find underwater. And, actually, the most amazing thing about these, or they first came to the attention of science because of their incredible regenerative powers. Basically, if you cut a hydra in half, it doesn't die. It regenerates entirely from whichever half of the body, and you end up with 2 hydra. In fact, you can even put hydra in a blender and mix them all up completely and end up with a whole load of new hydra. So they've got this incredible regenerative ability. But as scientists were studying this regenerative ability in the lab, they noticed something else rather amazing about them, which is that they appear to be what's called biologically immortal, or slightly more scientific, scientifically negligibly senescent. And that means they don't appear to age. Negligible obviously meaning not very much, and senescent just being the scientific word for aging. So what we find is that if you plot the Hydra's risk of death with time, it looks more like this. It's quite amazing, actually. It's incredibly low is the first thing. It's about 0.1, 0.2% per year, something like that. And secondly, it's constant. It's completely flat. So unlike humans, whose risk of death, as I keep saying, doubles every 8 years, this doesn't double. It doesn't ever double. And obviously, we haven't actually watched Hydra long enough to test this hypothesis out. But if that risk of death were to continue for effectively indefinitely, then we'd expect about 10% of those Hydra that you started the experiment with to still be alive after 1,000 years. So what's incredible about this isn't really the 1,000-year lifespan. It's the fact that their risk of death is constant with time. And that means that aging isn't a biological inevitability. It isn't just, that all animals have to age in a particular way. That's the way the laws of nature are laid down. So the question is, how can we be a bit more Hydra? How can we try and flatten our aging curve, try and reduce some of that death, push some of that suffering and disease back further later into life? And you might be thinking, well, Andrew, we're never going to make it to the point of being a Hydra. These are centimeter-long pond creatures. They're made of a comparative handful of cells compared to the trillions of cells that make up a human body. And actually, this negligible senescence is a much more common phenomenon than I think we've appreciated. So let's take a look at another example. This beautiful creature is a Galapagos Tortoise. It's actually the creature that graces the front of my book here in the UK. And the Galapagos Tortoise is another animal that appears to be negligibly senescent. The longest lived one was a tortoise called Harriet, which we think was picked up by Charles Darwin on the Galapagos Islands when he was visiting, doing his research that ultimately led to the origin of species. And she survived Darwin by over a century, living to the grand old age of 177 when she died of a heart attack. But what's most incredible, again, isn't exactly how long she lived. It's that the risk of death of these tortoises seems to be constant with time. And what that constancy means is tortoises get old without getting elderly. They're not at increased risk of disease, no matter how long ago they were born. They're, similarly sprightly. So, Harriet was probably zooming around just as fast at 150 as she was at age 50, which is to say not very quickly. She was obviously a tortoise after all. But the fact is there's no increase in frailty, no decrease in reproductive ability. These animals just seem to carry on basically in good health and then suddenly fall off a cliff at the end of their lives. And, surely that's something we could aspire to as humans. And tortoises are rather closer, evolutionarily speaking, to us than Hydra. And actually, it's not just tortoises. This beautiful beast here also displays negligible senescence. You might be thinking, Andrew, that's a penis with teeth. Actually, it's not. It's something called a naked mole rat, which is a little rodent. It's about sort of that size. And these things live for an incredible amount of time. They live for sort of 20 or 30 years, which is really incredible when you think about other comparable species, something like a rat or a mouse, which are very closely related rodents. If you keep them in the lab, they can live maybe 2 or 3 years on average. But these things are living, 10 times longer. So what is it about their biology that means they can be negligibly senescent? They can have this risk of death that doesn't change with time. What is it that we can learn from naked mole rats that can try to, we can try to then apply to our own biology? And what is it that allows them to basically dodge this phenomenon that we call aging? So we're going to have to return to this question, what is aging? And these are the answers that I gave before, but I'd just like to explain that these answers, it's a complete cheat, right? There are a couple of problems with them. The first is that every one of these actually encompasses a huge range of different things. So, for example, cancer, there are hundreds of kinds of cancer. If you think about vision loss, there are loads of different ways that you can lose your vision that result from getting older. So, if I were to really write this out, there are thousands of different categories that would have to be behind me. I'd have to make the text very, very small and spread it out incredibly widely in order to come up with all the different problems that can happen with you as you age. The other problem is that the way that we treat these in modern medicine tends to be very much one at a time. So again, to take the example of cancer, you might find a lump somewhere, go to your GP would refer you to your oncologist at a hospital. The oncologist would then, perhaps give you chemo or radiotherapy for that cancer. But they wouldn't really be taking into account, perhaps you've got some early stage heart disease because you're getting older. Perhaps you've got some early stage dementia. We're treating these individual diseases one at a time. So, with your dementia, you'd go and see the neurologist. You'd have effectively almost completely separate appointments. And the problem is that treating these things one at a time is a losing battle because there's always another one waiting in the wings that's going to try and kill you. So if you were to ask an aging biologist what is aging, they'd rather not give this enormous, thousands of items long list of terrible things that are sort of the end result of the aging process. What we've been trying to do is identify the causes of the aging process. So an aging biologist might give you an answer that looks a little bit more like this. And these are the 10 so-called hallmarks of aging that I break aging down into in my book. Don't worry about reading every single one of them, and some of them have some sort of quite complicated scientific sounding names. But what's really amazing about this list is that there are far fewer of these things. These 10 things, although they are kind of categories in themselves, there aren't thousands of these hallmarks. There are far fewer of them. And not only that, but they're far more fundamental. These are the causes that give rise to all those various diseases. So, for example, something like cancer, it's caused in part by the DNA damage, which is one of the first items on the list here. It's also caused by the immune dysfunction, which is one of the things at the very bottom of the list. And these hallmarks sort of combine together in various ways that cause those various diseases, these various dysfunctions, the frailty, the wrinkles, everything that we experience in late life. And the sort of exciting idea behind aging biology is that we can look at these hallmarks. We can potentially come up with ways to treat an individual hallmark, so ways to reduce the amount of damage our DNA obtains, ways to fix the problem proteins that accumulate in our bodies, and so on. And we can potentially treat many or even all of those age-related problems at the same time. And this is why, fundamentally, I think this is a revolution on a par with antibiotics, because in exactly the same way as you can use an antibiotic to treat a number of different bacterial infections, so too an anti-aging drug would be able to treat a number of different age-related diseases, as I say, maybe even all of them, and maybe even the sort of cosmetic signs, the wrinkles and the grey hair at the same time, which is a really, really exciting idea. Now, obviously, you'll be relieved to hear I've not got time for the whole list. What I thought I'd do is just go through a couple of these and give you some examples of how this will actually work in practice, because this all sounds very abstract, talking about malfunctioning mitochondria and some kind of drug that might fix them. So the two that I'm going to go through, we're going to start by looking at trimmed telomeres. And the reason for that is that this is one of the most common questions you get asked when you say you're working on aging biology. It doesn't have something to do with telomeres. And the answer is yes, but it's probably a bit more complicated than the story that you might have heard when this was really getting a lot of press back in the late 90s and early 2000s. So we're going to start by asking the question, what is a telomere? Well, this is what it might look like if you took a microscope image of the inside of one of your cells, right in the center of the cell, a nucleus. And what's going on here is all this blue stuff are chromosomes. These are the DNA, the instruction manual that makes up, tells your cells how to behave, effectively makes you you. And this is a fluorescence microscopy picture. So they've covered these various bits of the chromosomes in different glowing colored molecules that allow us to see them a bit more easily. So the blue bit is just the regular DNA. This is the chromosomes. And then the red and the green bits are the telomeres. And what you can see from this picture is that they're at the ends of the chromosomes. And so they sort of act as a protective cap for reasons that I'll explain in a moment. So if you were to zoom in on these telomeres, what you'd see is probably something a bit more like this. You might know that DNA is a sort of alphabet. It's got an alphabet of 4 chemical letters, A, T, C, and G. And the alphabet in the telomeres is very, very simple. It's just this repeated, effectively nonsense. It's just TTA, GGG, TTA, GGG, TTA, GGG, hundreds or even thousands of times. So you might be asking, why do our chromosomes end with this incredible array of just repeated 6 letters over and over and over and over again? It doesn't appear to have any, it's not containing any information. There's no genetic information. There's no genes, no important, stuff explaining to your cells how they're going to work. And the answer is, it's to solve a couple of rather ridiculous biological problems. The first is to protect the ends of our chromosomes from our DNA repair enzymes. And that's because if you find a flailing bit of loose DNA in your cell, what your body will assume is that's a bit of damage. That's something's chopped one of your chromosomes in two. And so it'll find another nearby bit of DNA and stick them together. And so what you don't want is your chromosomes, which is very important, are kept separate, to have these flailing ends and then be glued together by over-enthusiastic DNA repair enzymes. So that's one purpose that these telomeres serve. They sort of protect, they tell the DNA enzymes, don't bother with me. I mean, this TTAGGG is a sort of a pattern that tells those DNA enzymes to go away. But they also exist to correct for a strange evolutionary mistake when it comes to DNA copying. So you might know that our cells in our body are constantly dividing to replenish different tissues. And when your cells divide, they obviously have to make a copy of their DNA, a copy of that instruction manual, so that both of the daughter cells, as they're called, have that instruction manual and can continue to do whatever it is they're doing. And the problem is that our biology means that when our DNA is copied, we can't quite make it all the way to the end of a piece of DNA. It's absolutely crazy that evolution's had billions of years to work this out, and it's just never quite managed it. And what that means is that every time your cells divide, a little bit of DNA is chopped off the end of one of those chromosomes. So your chromosomes get shorter and shorter and shorter. And obviously, if that were to be, if that meant that the chromosome was losing vital information, a tiny bit of a gene every single time the cell divided, that would be really, really bad news, because that would mean that you'd be losing vital genetic information with every generation, every time a cell divided. And so your body would slowly start to go haywire. So the idea is that by putting this sort of effectively useless bunch, thousands and thousands of letters, your body can afford to lose those bits of DNA, and it doesn't cause any negative biological consequences. So, what you might expect to happen, therefore, is because because our cells are constantly dividing, if you look at how old someone is along the bottom of this graph, at this time, we're not going to have risk of death at the side. It's a different graph this time. We're going to have the length of telomeres. So because your telomeres are constantly dividing throughout life, you might expect that as someone gets older, the length of their telomeres is going to get shorter. So let's have a little look at what that looks like. These are lots of different telomere data here. Every one of these dots is a person who's had their telomere length measured depending on how old they are. And what you can see is there is a correlation. So you can see it is getting a little bit lower as people get older, but it's not a very strong one. And this is a particularly striking example. Like, who is this person? They're like 80, 85 years old, but they seem to be telomere Wolverine. They've got incredibly long telomeres. And quite apart from these handful of bizarre outliers, you can see that there are some over here somewhere, some sort of 40-year-olds who have telomeres that are shorter than some 80-year-olds. So you can see there's this really sort of quite wide dispersion. If you draw a line of best fit through it, which is something scientists are fond of doing, you can see that the telomere length drops by something like 20 per year. But that's, as I say, it's a sort of very weak correlation. It's not as strong as it might seem. However, people who have short telomeres for their age do seem to be at increased risk of death. They do seem to be at increased risk of getting various diseases, things like cancer. So what that means is maybe telomeres are something to do with the aging process. That would certainly seem like it made sense. So the good news is there's an enzyme called telomerase, and this is something that can add extra copies of that TTA-GGG repeated sequence on the end of our chromosomes. It can build those telomeres back up again, even after they've been chopped down after repeated cell division. And this actually, the discovery of the action of this enzyme won a Nobel Prize back in 2009. The problem with telomerase is it sounds like a really cool thing, but it's deactivated in most of our cells. And actually, that might seem bizarre, right? Because our biology has this ability to regrow these things that seem to be related to the aging process. These things can get too short and cause your cells to be unable to divide anymore. So why is it that evolution hasn't turned it on in all of our cells all of the time? And the answer is it's a cancer defense mechanism. It's because we don't want our cells to be able to divide indefinitely. Having these telomeres means that they can't divide too many times, and therefore it stops them before they can divide an infinite number of times and form a tumor. And in fact, cancer needs to turn that telomerase on again. 90% of cancers or so reactivate that telomerase to allow them to divide an infinite number of times. So it seems to be a cancer defense mechanism. So other stuff does need to go wrong for cancer to happen. It's not just a question of activating telomerase, but it's clearly something that's sort of a checkbox on cancer's to-do list. So what this means is that, back in the late 1990s when this stuff was first being examined, everyone was very excited about this idea that, perhaps we could just turn telomerase on and we could start to improve the lifespan of animals. And so people would get mice and they'd give them an extra copy of the telomerase gene, which was constantly activated, meaning their cells constantly had telomerase going on inside there, rebuilding those telomeres. But the problem was, the result was cancer. So after this sort of very excitable set of publicity in the late 90s or so, these first experiments in the late 90s and early 2000s confirmed this rather more cynical narrative that, telomerase isn't going to be this sort of enzyme that allows us to live forever. It's actually going to be something that, maybe could make you live a bit longer, but there's this really dark side to it, which is that it massively increases the risk of cancer. And as a result, the research field fell much more fallow. And I think this is partly just because scientists love the sort of cynical story of this incredible, widely touted fountain of youth, then having its incredible downfall that it's just a way of causing cancer. But thankfully, a few scientists did carry on this field of research, even though these early results didn't seem that promising. And so one example here is another experiment done in 2008. The mice were given not just a copy of the gene telomerase, but a copy of 3 other genes as well. And I'm not going to explain exactly what those do, but basically they're anti-cancer genes. They're genes that cause cells to commit suicide if they're looking like they're becoming a bit cancerous. And what the scientists found was that if you didn't just add the telomerase, if you added these 3 anti-cancer genes as well, the combined effect of that was that the mice lived about 40% longer than mice that hadn't had this genetic modification, and it didn't seem to come with any extra risk of cancer. So those anti-cancer genes were doing their job and working in tandem with the telomerase to increase lifespan. So it does appear that actually there is something to this idea. And most recently, scientists have given not a permanent copy of telomerase, an extra copy of the gene that's constantly on, extending the telomeres all of the time, but they've given a sort of temporary copy. It's a little bit like actually the way mRNA vaccines work. They pop in a piece of genetic code that can then produce, rather than the spike protein as in the vaccines, they can produce telomerase just for a short period of time, just enough time to bump up the length of the telomeres, but not so much time that the body has this telomerase activated all the time. And this too dramatically reduces the risk of cancer and compared to just having telomerase on constantly, and it meant the mice live 20% longer. So I think what this really shows us is the simple story of telomerase as this immortality enzyme isn't correct, because it does come with a cancer risk, but there are ways that you can mitigate that cancer risk. And so hopefully, that's something that we can think about, how we can turn these early results in mice into something that could work in people. So I've said I'm going to go through a couple of these hallmarks. We've been through telomeres. I'm then going to talk about what I think is the most exciting exciting thing in the short term, which is the existence of these things called senescent cells, and more importantly, our ability to use drugs to remove these cells. So senescent, I already mentioned, is the biological word for aging. And these are cells that accumulate in all of our bodies as we get older. And they're cells that seem to drive the aging process. They seem to make all kinds of different diseases more likely. There are lots of different reasons your cells can become senescent. They can have divided too many times. Actually, they can have telomeres that are too short. So that really connects to what we were just talking about. But they can also they can be stressed out, because as you get older, your body becomes a more stressful place to be for a cell. And if a cell gets stressed, rather than dividing and risk becoming a cancer, it can put on the brakes. It can enter this senescent state, this aged state. And scientists have known about these for a very long time. They've known that these cells accumulate in our bodies as we get older, and they've known that they cause diseases. But what's most exciting is that we've now got the ability to use what are called senolytic drugs. These are drugs that can kill the senescent cells and leave the rest of the cells of your body intact. So back in, I think it was 2015, scientists did an experiment where they gave mice these senescent cells. They waited until they got to 24 months old, which is quite old for a mouse. As I sort of mentioned earlier, mice live typically 2 or 3 years in the lab. So 24 months is about equivalent to sort of 70 years in human aging. So they got these very old mice. They gave them these drugs. And what they found was that by deleting their senescent cells, they basically became biologically younger. So firstly, they lived a bit longer. Obviously, that's a good thing. But they weren't just hobbling along in ill health, extending the geriatric period of life. They got fewer diseases. They got less cancer. They got less heart disease. They got less cataracts. So that's already a good thing. They're living longer with fewer diseases. It's not just the diseases. They get less frailty. So they can run further and faster on the little mousy treadmills they use in these experiments. They found that mice that are given senolytics become more curious. So perhaps it can reverse some of this neurodegeneration. So if you put an older mouse into a maze, it'll often be less exploratory. It'll run around and explore its environment less than a younger mouse would. Perhaps it's a bit more anxious. Perhaps it's just a bit lazier, because it's just that little bit older. And what they found is that by giving mice senolytics, you can rejuvenate some of that youthful curiosity. And honestly, these mice just look great. They have much better fur. They have much better, plumper, thicker skin than mice that haven't been given the drugs. And what this shows us is that these senescent cells seem to be an underlying hallmark, a cause of most, perhaps even all, of the aging process. They drive this whole variety of different diseases, this frailty, even the cosmetic signs. And so that's just a really exciting idea. This is sort of the holy grail, the dream of anti-aging research, is a drug, a pill that you could take that would prevent this whole range of different age-related changes. And one of the reasons I'm so excited about senolytics is that this obviously is a very promising set of results in mice. It's not just this experiment. There are lots of others that corroborate this result, but also they've begun human trials. There are 20 or 30 companies now trying to turn senolytics from this idea that works in mice in the lab to something that actually works for humans in the clinic. So it's a really, really exciting time. And these things are probably going to be available in the next few years, I would hope, if the clinical trials go well. At first, it'll probably be for specific diseases. So things like, there are various age-related diseases, like there's one called lung fibrosis that's known to be driven by senescent cells. But hopefully, if the drugs prove effective, and most importantly, if they prove safe, then we might think about giving these to people who don't have a disease. People who are maybe 50 or 60 years old. There's nothing quote unquote wrong with them, apart from how long ago they were born. But they just accumulated enough of ththese senescent cells that we can clear them out and hopefully stop them from getting unwell in the first place. So that's a really, really exciting near-term idea that I think is going to happen hopefully within the next 10 years. And it really shows you that this anti-aging medicine isn't just some pie in the sky dream, some sci-fi stuff that's sort of happening, beginning to start off in labs. It's actually going into human trials and starting right now. So what I thought I'd do just for the last few minutes of the talk is ask this question, which is, should we cure aging? And I find it sort of strange that this question gets asked in some ways, because what I've talked about throughout this whole talk is the idea of medicines that can prevent us from getting unwell. And I think in almost any other context, if I'd given a talk about cancer prevention, then no one in the audience at the end of the talk would stick their hand up and say, but Andrew, if we prevent all this cancer and people get ill later, won't there be a problem because people are living longer and we'll get overpopulation? And won't there be a problem because people are going to have these extended years of healthy life? Won't they get bored? But somehow we seem to place the treatment of aging in its own sort of separate moral, ethical category. And I think it's really important just to sort of demystify this a bit and make it seem a bit less sci-fi and weird by explaining, sort of what I think about some of these ethical questions and how I approach thinking about them. And I actually think that there's more detail to be gone into here than I'm going to be able to manage in the next sort of 5 or 10 minutes. But I really think the moral case for treating aging is completely watertight. I think it is our single biggest humanitarian challenge, and it's something I very much think we need to get on with as soon as possible. And the most common Oh, yeah, sorry. So the most common question that I get asked is definitely the one about population. And actually, I've just made a YouTube video about this. If you want to go into huge detail, you can check it out on my YouTube channel. But I just like to give the most simple answer that I give, not just to this question, but to a lot of different ethical questions that relate to the morality of aging biology. And that answer is quite simply to reverse the question. So when people are worried about population, they're worried that as we reduce death, we make people die later, have longer lifespans as a result of aging. It's going to result in an increase in the global population. It's going to increase climate change. It's going to increase all different kinds of things like plastic pollution, other kinds of pollution. It's going to increase the amount of land we need to grow all our food. And we're already pushing up against natural limits for this, in all different domains in the Earth's biosphere. So how can this possibly be sustainable? Well, there are lots of different answers you can give. My favourite, as I say, is this one where you reverse the question. So currently we're in a situation where we're worried about population and we have aging. Let's imagine we lived in an ageless civilization, a civilization where aging had been cured, where our risk of death looked like the Hydra's. It was constant no matter how long ago we were born. People would still die, there'd still be infectious disease, there'd still be buses to be hit by and so on, but people are living much longer, healthier lives than they are in our current society. But then imagine simultaneous with that, we had an absolute population catastrophe. We had 20 billion people on the planet, environmental disaster. We were, we were emitting far too much carbon dioxide. There was huge global warming. We were trashing the rainforests, etc., etc. The question is, in this reversed vantage point, would you invent aging in order to solve the problem of population? And my answer to that is, I really don't think you would. I think you'd try absolutely everything first. You'd try reducing your carbon dioxide emissions. You'd change people's diets. You'd change the way that people consume things. You'd try and affect society and the economy to reduce our impact on the planet. And if all of these measures failed, and as an absolute last resort, you decided there was literally nothing you could do apart from actually killing people, and I really suggest you should think very carefully before suggesting that as a solution to anything, then would you invent aging to do that? Would you have people, spending 20, 30, 40 years slowly declining, getting these huge number of different diseases, needing loads of health and social care that's going to cost the economy trillions and trillions of dollars? I really don't think you would. I think you'd find a more humane way to kill people than this aging process. And as a result, since the answer is so clear in the orientation where we've not got aging and we have got one of these problems, I think when you switch the problem round to our current situation where we do have aging, and we're also worried about the exacerbation of those problems, I don't think that stopping aging biology, effectively stopping medical research, is an answer to any serious moral objection. So as I say, I think that works in quite a lot of different contexts. Whether you're worried about boredom or pensions or whatever it is, try thinking about reversing the question, or whether you'd invent aging to solve a pension crisis or something like that. The last thing I want to do is just show you why I'm really excited about this from an economic point of view, and why I really want to get the word out about aging biology. And that's something that I sort of alluded to as I was just talking there, which is just how expensive aging is to the economy versus how much we invest in researching in it. So let's have a look at the cost of these various chronic diseases. And these are numbers for the US because they were the ones that are a bit easier to get hold of. Cancer costs the US $280 billion every year. Heart disease, 200 billion. Stroke, 110 billion. Dementia, 270 billion. These are just some of the diseases of aging, my four sort of favorite, I guess that's the wrong word, but the ones that I've been constantly referring to throughout this talk. So this is very nearly $1 trillion on its own. And actually the total cost of the US healthcare system, an awful lot of which is treating the chronic diseases of aging, is about $4 trillion. So it's an incredible sum of money. So what I'd like to do is compare this enormous annual cost to the economy with the amount that the US invests in aging research. And the US is quite unusual. It's got something called the NIA, the National Institute on Aging, which is is a government organization specifically devoted to researching aging. And as you can see, its budget is this little tiny green square up here. That's in proportion to the size of the amount of money that's spent. It's just $3.5 billion. So, compare that $3.5 billion to $4 trillion, which is the total spending on US healthcare. That's already less than a thousandth. But actually, it's worse than these numbers suggest, because the NIA, there's a sort of running joke in aging biology. The NIA doesn't stand for National Institute on Aging. It stands for National Institute on Alzheimer's. So let's break that budget down a little bit. The majority of the NIA's budget actually goes into what's called the NIA Neuroscience Division. This is basically the division that's interested in researching Alzheimer's and other kinds of dementia. And that means that most of that money isn't looking at the aging process that causes those kinds of dementia. It's looking at the dementia itself. As I said, this sort of silo mentality about looking at individual diseases. The NIA also does a bunch of other stuff, things like social gerontology and that kind of thing, which takes up a huge amount of the rest of the budget. And so its aging biology division gets just $350 million. So less than a 10,000th of US healthcare spending. And actually, it's even worse than that. It always is, because the aging biology division is primarily interested in understanding the fundamental mechanisms of aging rather than coming up with treatments for it. Obviously, that's incredibly important work. You can't treat something that you don't understand the mechanisms of. But at the same time, it means the amount of money that's being invested in actually in actually developing treatments for aging is an absolutely minuscule quantity of the amount of money that we spend on healthcare, the amount of money we spend on care of people who are getting older, the amount of money that's lost to the economy because people have to give up work, either because they themselves are getting older and getting ill, or because one of their relatives, is getting older and getting ill and needs looking after. So these are enormous costs, and we're investing far, far too little in actually doing this research, even though, as I said in this talk, this has the potential to be the greatest development in medicine since the discovery of antibiotics. So fundamentally, that's why I wrote this book. I really wanted to raise awareness of this fascinating and important science. I found that, it wasn't just members, it wasn't, I hadn't heard much about this before I started reading about it at the end of my PhD. Obviously, people I speak to, the average person on the street, surveys show haven't heard much about aging biology. I've even found that biologists and doctors haven't heard much about aging biology either. So I decided the best thing to do was to sort of write a book and try and raise the profile of this, show that it's not just sci-fi. So if this talk has piqued your interest and you'd like to have a look at my book, this is what it looks like. You can get a copy at ageless.link, find out a little bit more about that. I also thought I'd give you a few links of different places you can find me on the internet, on Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. Those are my various different handles. And I think that's just about all I've got time to say today. And I think we've got a few minutes for some questions at the end. So I'm hoping that some questions are going to come through on my Zoom now, and I can try and give you some answers. Not getting very much by way of questions on the Zoom. Okay, so there haven't been any questions asked. So if anyone has got any questions, do just pop them in the YouTube chat, and I can get around to answering them as quickly as possible. I guess, if there aren't any questions, we can probably wrap it up. Here we go. Do plants age in the same way as animals? That is a good question. It's a complicated question. Actually, the oldest organisms that we know of in the world are plants. They're a tree called the bristlecone pine, which you can find in the White Mountains of California. And the oldest bristlecone pine has lived to the ripe old age, having counted the tree rings, so it's just exactly as you'd have done in primary school, to the ripe old age of 4,860 years, I think was the last count. So these trees can probably live to over 5,000 years old, which is a really incredible length of time. This means that those trees were germinating at the same time as, this was before the pyramids were being built, before even Stonehenge existed, which is really incredible. And the question of whether they age the same way as animals, they probably share a lot of similar fundamental mechanisms, but what you find is that the aging of plants can look quite different. So we talked about regular senescence in humans, where your risk of death increases with time. We've talked about negligible senescence, where the risk of death can be flat with time. Actually, quite a few different plants have what's called negative senescence. So they have a decreasing risk of death with time. And you can imagine why that makes sense. If you're a sapling, a brand new tree just sprouted, you're at quite a lot of risk. You're tiny, so that means if something starts to nibble on you, then you can just end up vanishing. Whereas as you become a really, really big, sturdy tree, you're much more resilient to disease or drought or whatever those different threats might be. So there are a whole variety of different ways, sort of trajectories of aging in the plant kingdom. And they're often quite different to animals just because they have a very different sort of life cycle. Animals don't in the same way grow into these. There are a few animals that just carry on growing throughout their lives. There are certain kinds of fish that keep on growing and therefore we think have negligible or negative senescence for that reason. But yeah, plants just have a fascinating and quite different biology to us. And we've got a question from Roche, which is, how do we get the materials to turn these into pills? Well, actually, it's not too challenging in some cases. So to give the example of the senolytics, these are drugs that the combination they used on mice in that paper were a couple of drugs called dasatinib and quercetin. And dasatinib is just a chemo drug, so that's something that we already can make into pills. And quercetin is a it's something called a flavanol. So actually, some people supplement use quercetin as a supplement, even though the evidence for its use isn't particularly strong. But by mixing these things together, they found that was the most potent way to kill the senescent cells while leaving the rest of the cells intact. And so obviously, that's going to be very easy to make into pill form. And I think that a lot of these early drugs are going to be things that can be made into pills. Or sorry, a lot of these early treatments are going to be things that can be made into pills, because that's something that the pharmaceutical industry is really, really expert at already. We find a particular thing we want to do, whether it's delete senescent cells, whether it's improve the function of mitochondria, whatever it is, whichever one of those hallmarks we're going to be going after, and find a drug that can do that. But not all of these treatments are going to be drugs. So I'm pretty confident that, maybe in 10 or 20 years' time, rather than 5 or 10 years' time, we're going to be thinking about gene therapies and stem cell therapies and that kind of thing, where we're going to be using very different ways of delivering these kinds of medicines. So it's going to be something where we give an extra copy of a gene to your cells, which might be a gene that slows down the aging process. It might be a gene that deals with a particular form of waste product that accumulates in your body as you age. So I think there are going to be a whole variety of different treatments, some of which are going to be very easy to turn into pills, and others of which we're going to have to deliver in completely new and exciting ways. I got a question from Francis, which is, what is the research situation in the UK? The answer is, there are some really cool, groups working on aging in the UK. There's a nice big group at UCL doing some work. There's some people in Newcastle and a group in Brighton. So there are, people, and that's not an exhaustive list by any means. There are people at lots of different universities doing this research. The real challenge, and part of the reason that I use those US statistics as part of the talk, is that we don't have a centralized funding body that researches aging specifically. And a few years ago, I was trying to put together some numbers on the various different items of science funding. And I emailed lots of different people, civil servants in government departments, trying to find out how much we spend on aging biology. And the problem is, and this is part of the political problem that I want to solve by raising the profile of it, aging often isn't recognized as a distinct area of research. A lot of the time, when the government does issue a funding call and say, we want scientists to work on aging, then what will happen is that people who are, for example, cancer researchers, will put a bid in for that money and say, give us money for this because cancer is a disease of aging, which is true, but it means that that research money then ends up not being used for the aging biology itself. It basically ends up being disease-specific research, but just under a slightly different umbrella. And so I'm afraid that that's a long way of saying, I don't think we really know. The number that I came up with, which I'm not, in any way confident in, was that we spend something like 40 pence per person per year on aging research in the UK, which is just mind-blowing. 40p, for something that's about 90% likely to be what kills us in the rich world. And if you're a bit younger and, that number's only increasing, it's going to be far more than 90% likely to kill you. And yet we're spending literally pence per person per year. So I really think we need to, this is why I really encourage people to write to their MP or try and just raise the profile of this stuff, because it needs to be recognized in order to get the amount of funding that it deserves. So that's all the questions I can see on my screen. Has anyone else got one, or is that it? Okay, so I guess unless anyone's got any final questions, that's it. Perfect. Well, thank you very much to everyone for coming. And I say coming, as I say, hopefully sitting comfortably at home. Have a lovely rest of your day, and thank you very much.